use is it's like putting a puzzle together. So chapter 7 is the border, because you always put the border together first, right? Chapter 7 is the border of the puzzle, and then as the chapters progress, you start filling in the border, and you start getting a clearer and clearer and clearer picture. You follow me so far? All right, so having said that, let's look at the first 2 verses of Daniel chapter 8. And just keep in mind, this was originally written in Hebrew. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. So the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign is an important part of understanding the text, because it establishes that this vision in chapter 8 occurred over 2 centuries in 551 BC before the events of chapter 8 actually happened and will happen. Because what you're going to see tonight is you're going to see a type of Antichrist, a guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, and then you're going to see the angel Gabriel talk about the actual Antichrist. So the events that have happened historically in chapter 8 happened over 2 centuries after Daniel predicted they would happen. Now remember, we've talked about this quite a bit because this is really, really important. The longest time, skeptics and critics kept saying that the book of Daniel was written long, long after the events happened. That's why he got the history so precise and concise. And as archaeology, as we've talked about over the past several weeks, as archaeology has shown over and over again, no, that actually isn't true. Daniel was actually written way before the events actually happened. Okay? Now, the other thing that's important to note, Daniel is living in Babylon at this time, but his vision puts him in Susa. Okay? Susa was the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire, which would indicate that Daniel's vision took him from the capital of Babylon to the capital of Persia. And it also would indicate then that when Daniel interpreted the handwriting on the wall in chapter 5, he understood, based on his vision here in chapter 8 and also in chapter 7, what was going to happen to Babylon, which is why he could say what he said to Belshazzar. Remember, he said, I don't want any of your stuff because your kingdom is done, and a few hours later it was. Does that make sense? So what's really important to understand is that, remember, we talked about this several weeks ago. Daniel, the book of Daniel, isn't necessarily written in chronological order. It's written thematically, but not chronologically, okay? And chapter 7 and chapter 8 prove that because they come, the events of chapter 7 and 8 happened way before the events of chapter 5, okay? Now, what I'm going to do today, this is going to be a little bit different how we do this. And because of my ADHD, I'm going to try to stick to my notes as much as possible because we have so much ground to cover. Because if you don't like history, you probably should just leave now. There's so much history here that is tied to the prophecies. But I think as you're going to see, and this is one of the things that I've learned over my almost now 26 years of teaching, you can't separate history and theology. They have to go hand in hand. Because that's how God is unfolding his divine plan for us through the medium of history, right? And so you're gonna get a mouthful of it today. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read the vision, and then I'm gonna read the interpretation of the vision. So for example, I'm gonna read verses 3 and 4, and then I'm gonna read verse 20. Now, what happens is Daniel doesn't understand what he's seeing, and so the angel Gabriel, which we'll read through this here in a minute, comes to him and explains to him what's going to happen or what it means. Okay? So, verses 3 and 4, chapter 8. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram, which had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now, the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. That's verses 3 and 4. Now, go over to verse 20, and this is Gabriel's interpretation to Daniel of what he saw. Verse 20 says this, "The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia." So, the ram with the two horns is Medo-Persia, with the longer horn being Persia, as it was more powerful. The Persians were way more powerful than the Medes. The Medo-Persian, this is what's neat about verse 4. The Medo-Persian Empire did expand west, north, and south, but it never expanded east. And verse 4 says that very thing. "I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue him from his power, but he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself." So Daniel's vision in verse 4 is historically accurate with regards to the Persian Empire's expansion. Now remember, this vision occurred in 551 BC, and the Persians would conquer Babylon 12 years later on October 12th, 539 BC, and at that time, Babylon was southwest of Susa. Okay? So, that's pretty straightforward. Here's where it starts to get kind of interesting. Well, not kind of, it's amazing. Well, I'm going to read verses 5 through 14, and then I'm going to skip over to verses 21 through 25. "While I was observing," verse 5, "behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. He came up to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on the ram, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns towards the four winds of heaven. Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horns along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored." Now jump over to verses 21 through 25. This is Gabriel speaking to Daniel again and telling Daniel what his vision means. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the long horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people, and through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. Okay, now, in order to properly exegete this text and Gabriel's interpretation of it, I've got to give you this Greek history lesson. And I warned you, and you didn't leave, so this is on you now. In verse 21 of chapter 8, the shaggy goat in Daniel's vision represents Greece. And, as you will soon see, if we understand Greek history, it will make Daniel's vision a lot easier to understand. So, hear me out on this, because this is a total aside, but it's going to wrap right back into what's happening. Alexander the Great was born in 336 BC. He was the son of the Macedonian king Philip, who was murdered when Alexander was 20 years old. And I'm going to say this, and I truly believe this. I'm not joking when I say this. I believe the only person in human history that was and is more important and influential to human history than Alexander was and is our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I truly believe that. Now, why would I say that? I say that because of the continued influence on the world that Western Greek culture has had and continues to have. Remember last week we talked about how the West has influenced every inch of this planet? In some of you even came up afterwards and were bringing up subjects that Greek and Roman culture have influenced, even that we didn't talk about, medicine, philosophy, sexuality, language, all of that stuff. And America is a Western culture. We resemble ancient Rome more than anything, right? Well, listen to this. Alexander was taught for 13 years by Aristotle. And Aristotle convinced Alexander that Greek culture was the most important culture in the history of the world. The Greeks were hopelessly arrogant, right? Hopelessly arrogant. In fact, they were also hopelessly chauvinistic as well. This is kind of a weird aside, but hear me out on this. Because Solomon's right, there's nothing new under the sun. Greeks viewed homosexuality as a more enlightened form of sexuality, males sleeping with males, because they were so chauvinistic, right? They literally thought their poop did not stink, okay? In fact, because of Alexander, there was a term that was coined. It was called Hellenization. And Aristotle convinced Alexander that the only way that he could truly be a world conqueror is if he Hellenized the world. The word Hellenization comes from the Greek word Hellene, which means to be Greek. So what Aristotle taught Alexander was this: it's not enough for you to conquer a people group. The Assyrians did it, they were defeated. The Babylonians did it, they were defeated. The Persians did it, they were defeated by the Greeks. In order to truly conquer a people group, you have to get them to assimilate into your culture. Once you've done that, you've got them, okay? And so that's what Alexander was taught. He was taught, okay, you're going to go conquer these people, but then you got to make them think and act and talk and be Greek, okay? Now, this is really important to understand. For Alexander, it wasn't enough for people to be conquered. They also needed to be influenced by the culture itself. So when Alexander became king at the age of 20 in 336 after his father's untimely murder, he united the Greek city-states and embarked on a 13-year quest to make the known world Greek. At the time of Alexander's conquests, the Greek Empire had been steadily rising while the Persian Empire was in notable decline. If you look at your Old Testament handout of Israel's history, you can see that. If you go all the way back to 490 BC, which was, obviously over 1.5 centuries before Alexander showed up on the scene, the Greeks first initially defeated the Persians at the Battle of Marathon. You know why running a marathon is 26.2 miles? Because after the Greeks, it was a total upset. They didn't think that they were going to win. After the Greeks defeated the Persians at Marathon, they sent a messenger, and he ran the entire way back to Athens from where the Battle of Marathon was fought, 26.2 miles, to deliver the message. Then the Athenians sent him back. He had to run back. He got back to Marathon and delivered the message, and he dropped dead. They would have never sent me. First of all, I can't run anymore. Second of all, I'd have made it about a half a mile and I'd have dropped dead anyway. So they never would have got the message. But as you can see, The Greeks, all the way back 1.5 centuries before Alexander even ascended to the throne, were already starting to whittle away at the Persians. So Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, it wasn't so amazing because it happened. The Greeks were starting to do this anyway. What has amazed historians down through time was how fast he did it. He did it in 3 years. 3 years, it was all it took for the ram to be destroyed. Alexander became king in 336. He united the city-states, and he started on his quest of world domination. And in 331 BC, the last Persian king, Darius III, was defeated at Gaugamela. And as he was running away, his own bodyguards, because they wanted to make sure that they too were not punished, they murdered him. So he actually suffered a mutiny, and after a humiliating defeat, he was actually murdered by his own people. Alexander, after that, proceeded to conquer all the way into India before his untimely death on June 13th, 323 BC, at the ripe old age of 33. There's much debate over how he died and why he died. Some say it was from a sexually transmitted disease. Others think it was a heart. They just don't know. Some think he was poisoned. There is just no way to know. He was actually buried in Babylon, which is where he died. And when he died, because he had no male heir, in fact, he had no kids at all, his empire was divvied up between 4 generals, guys by the name of Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. And this only happened after 22 years of political maneuvering and Greek infighting. If you look at the Old Testament historical timeline again, you'll see that Alexander died in 323, but the empire wasn't divided officially until 301, okay? Because he had a lot of generals, and there were a lot of guys fighting for power, and those 4 guys ended up being the guys, okay? Now, if you go back to chapter 8, verse 8, it says, "Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly," that's Alexander, "but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." And the way they divided up the empire was north, south, east, and west, okay? Now, the 2 generals that are important for us from a biblical standpoint are Ptolemy and Seleucus. Lysimachus and Cassander both inherited lands that had nothing to do with the promised land. Now, look at the pre-New Testament timeline, okay, because we're going to go through this. We're going to look at some of this stuff. When the Ptolemies took over and ruled over the Jews, you can see that there, roughly 323 to 198 BC. The Jews lived in relative peace for over a century. They were ruled by Ptolemy and then his successors. They worshiped and lived as they had wanted. And they did so because Alexander gave them that freedom. Remember last week we talked about how he marched on Jerusalem, and they were terrified because they had sided with the Persians. They were more culturally aligned with Persia. But because they read passages of Daniel to Alexander, he took this as a good sign and allowed them to live in peace and worship as they wanted, and he didn't destroy or sack the city of Jerusalem. But here's the problem. The Jews were greatly influenced by the Hellenization of the land, so much so that by Jesus' day, Jews could no longer speak or read Hebrew. If you look at your pre-New Testament timeline, you'll see the second thing on that timeline from 251 to 200 BC is that the Septuagint, also known as the LXX, is translated. Now, what is that? The Septuagint was the Old Testament written in Greek, okay? The reason and they did it in Alexandria in Egypt. The reason that the Jewish scholars did that was because they knew that their people, the majority of them, couldn't read Hebrew anymore. Now, why is this a problem? Some of you have heard me talk about this a million times. Sociological studies show that a culture's language is more closely tied to the culture than any other aspect. any other aspect. You lose the language, you lose the culture. One of the things that makes the Septuagint such a bad Old Testament is that it doesn't translate well, okay? Near Eastern languages don't translate well into Western languages because they don't necessarily have the same type of thinking, number one, but they also don't have the same words and things like that. For example, and I always use this example, but I'll use it again. I taught on the Crow Reservation for 6 years at Little Bighorn College, and I think there's about 14,000 registered Crows, and probably only about 3,000 or 4,000 of them speak Crow. Okay, and there's a real focus now in that tribe to bring back Crow language, and Little Bighorn College requires you, regardless of what ethnicity you are, you're required to take Crow for at least 2 to 4 semesters. I can't remember maybe they've changed it now. In fact, one of my colleagues, his name is John Schreier. I think you probably know John. He is the language professor over at Montana Bible College, and he's one of those guys that he's really, really good with languages. Like he was a translator in the military, so he knows Arabic, he knows Aramaic, he knows Greek, he knows Hebrew, but he actually preaches at a church in Hardin, and one of the things he's been doing is helping. I think it's Wycliffe translate the entire New Testament into Crow. Kind of a cool thing. So, but all that to say this, when I was teaching there, several of the students would speak in Crow to one another, and I would always joke and say, you can't talk in Crow because I think you're talking about me. But interspersed in their conversations, you'd hear English words. And so I asked about it, and I said, well, why do you do that? Well, Crow is what's known as a dead language. It doesn't expand like our English language. We're making up new words all the time, right? They don't. Right? And so, for example, airplane. Well, there's no such word in the Crow for airplane, so they say it in English. Does that make sense? My whole point is that, and Native American languages are more closely aligned to Eastern and Near Eastern languages. Same with the culture. It's more similar, which is why Western culture and Native American culture has clashed for so long, because it's not the same. Right? They're more like Near Eastern culture and Eastern culture than they are Western culture. And this is what happened to the Jews. Okay? The Jews got influenced by Western culture to the point where they lost their culture. So, and this is a sidetrack, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because it's really, really important. Because the vast majority of Jews couldn't speak or read Hebrew by the time Jesus came around, during the intertestamental period, which is this entire timeline, okay? During the intertestamental period, a group of Jews, mostly who were from the tribe of Levi or were devoutly religious from a Jewish perspective, came along and said, we are not going to allow the culture to wreck, the Greek culture to wreck our Hebrew culture. So they decided that they were going to only speak Hebrew to one another. They were going to keep the Old Testament the way it was. They weren't going to focus on the language. And so they became known as what was called the Hasidim. It's a Hebrew word or title that means godly ones. Okay? In Greek, they were called the Pharisees. Okay? Are you connecting the dots here already? Yeah. Another group of guys came along who said that they were going to be called separatists. This in Greek they were called the Syndikoi or Syndics. And in English, we call them Sadducees. Okay? So, the Old Testament ends, there's no such thing as a Pharisee and a Sadducee. The New Testament starts, there they are. Well, this is where they came from. These guys were saying, we are not going to allow Greek culture to ruin our culture. We're going to hold on to our language, we're going to hold on to our culture, and we're going to keep it. And they did, which is why they were so well respected and why they were listened to by the time Jesus comes along. And also why they hated Jesus so bad, because because they were corrupt and they had been corrupted down through time, and Jesus was totally exposing their corruption, right? But the people listened to them because the people were like, well, we know that the Greek language is inferior to the Hebrew when it comes to translating the Old Testament, but these guys know Hebrew, so we're going to listen to them. So when these guys started adding all this crap to the law and forcing the people to do it, the people said, okay, they're the ones that know, they're the Hasidim. Is it making sense? Really important to understand. And so you start to see these connections here between what is going on in the New Testament with what happened during the intertestamental period. Now, because the Ptolemies, who were ruling the Jews, were focused more on culture than they were on conquest. In fact, historians and archaeologists estimate that the library in the city of Alexandria had over 500,000 scrolls. That's incredible for that day, right? Because paper was not in a large supply in that time of the world. But they also built museums, they built libraries. They were the cultured people. Ptolemy always kind of fancied himself as a cultural person. Okay? So because of that, they were susceptible to the power-hungry Seleucid dynasty. And if you look at verses 9 through 14, it says this of chapter 8. Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. Now, the Seleucids, or Seleucus, when he took over, and then his successors after him, they controlled the area around Babylon. So they would have controlled what would have been Afghanistan, Western India, Iraq, and Iran. That's where Seleucus, the one of Alexander's 4 generals, that's where his little empire was. Ptolemy controlled Palestine, so what would be modern-day Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, and into Egypt. That was the Ptolemies' rule, okay? Look again what verse 9 says. Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. That's where the Seleucids wanted to expand. They didn't go west. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Now, go back to your pre-New Testament timeline. If you go to 198 BC, it's the fourth thing down. It says the Seleucid dynasty defeats the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panion. Panion was an actual town. In the New Testament, it was called Caesarea Philippi. Okay? And it's where Jesus had a pretty profound discussion with his disciples, and it's where he called Peter Satan. Anyway, that's beside the point, but that's another lesson for another day. So, once the Seleucids were able to go as far south as Caesarea Philippi, which I don't think it's on this map here, as far south as Caesarea Philippi, and they defeated the Ptolemies, they basically had all of Egypt and everything opened up to them. Okay? So they now operated in most of the old Babylonian Empire, parts of Persia, and they made their capital in Antioch, which is in modern-day Syria. It still exists today. But they wanted more. So they waged war against the Ptolemies until they pushed them all the way into Egypt. Okay? But that is where they ran into a problem. Okay? The Romans were growing in power. And if you look at the pre-New Testament timeline again, it says 202 BC, Hannibal, he's the elephant guy, is defeated by the Romans at the Battle of Zama, and he flees to Syria. The reason Hannibal fled to Syria was because he was allied with the Seleucid king, a guy by the name of Antiochus III. Okay? Now, after Antiochus III died, after he was defeated at the Battle of Zama, and after he was defeated again at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, which is, you go down on your timeline, you see that there, Antiochus III and Hannibal defeated by Scipio and the Romans at Magnesia. The Romans took much of the Ptolemaic or the Seleucid lands in the north and northeast, and they forced the Seleucids to pay a ton of taxes. They did it because they were trying to bankrupt them for trying to rebel against Rome. So, when Antiochus III died in 175 BC, his younger son, Antiochus IV, murdered his older brother and who was the rightful heir to the throne, and took power for himself. Realizing he could not defeat the Romans in the north, he focused his attention on the south and the southwest, namely Egypt and Palestine, because he knew that Ptolemy VI, who was the king of the Ptolemies at that time, was incredibly weak. So he rolled into Palestine in 174 BC, and he rolled into Jerusalem, and he removed the high priest and inserted a guy that wasn't even Jewish as the high priest, and he then moved into Egypt, and he named himself king of Egypt. And that's where the Romans said, no, this guy's getting too big for his britches. So the Romans intervened. So in 168, a guy by the name of Gaius Laenus checked Antiochus IV on the beach on a beach in Egypt. This is a really cool story, and this is where we get one of our euphemisms that we use today. So Gaius Laenus showed up in Egypt with a massive Roman fleet, and Antiochus IV knew right away that he didn't have a prayer. So Gaius Laenus said, let's have a talk on the beach, and Antiochus thought that they were going to negotiate, but when Gaius got out of the boat with all of the Romans in the boats ready to go to battle, he walked up to Antiochus, they greeted one another, and historians write that Gaius Laenus took his walking stick, and in the sand, he drew a circle around Antiochus. He drew a line in the sand. That's where that phrase comes from. And he said to him, reportedly, if you cross this line, we will destroy you. And Antiochus, knowing that he was going to be destroyed if he did, had to stand there in that circle humiliated until Gaius Laenus got back on the boat and waited for their response. Okay? Well, that line in the sand on the beaches of North Africa, on the beach of Egypt, completely humiliated Antiochus Epiphanes. And it emboldened the Jews back in Jerusalem to revolt. Okay? So they did. And it humiliated Antiochus Epiphanes. And by the way, the Jews called him, and Epiphanes in Greek means manifest God. So the Jews, and Jews are always been clever with word plays. They would call him Antiochus Epimanes. And Epimanes means madman. And he was crazy. He was absolutely crazy. So Antiochus Epiphanes, or Epimanes, however you want to call him, he returned to Jerusalem hearing about the revolt, and he besieged the city on the Sabbath, knowing that most of the Jews would not fight back. He then proceeded to act in probably one of the most anti-Semitic fashions that would make even the anti-Semites on the Ivy League campuses blush. He outlawed circumcision, he offered swine's flesh on the altar, and sprinkled pig's blood on the Holy of Holies. This is what became known as the abomination of desolation. Now, as we progress in the book of Daniel, we're going to hear this term again, but it's going to be referring to the actual Antichrist, okay? What I'm going to promote for you tonight is that what Daniel is saying is just like there are types of Christ throughout the Bible. You know, Joseph was a type of Christ. Isaac was a type of Christ. What's Ruth's husband's name? Boaz was. All these guys are types of Christ. There are also down through history types of antichrists. Hitler, Stalin, Antiochus Epiphanes, Nero, Titus, guys like that. Okay? So, this became known as the abomination of desolation. Okay? Having said that, Antiochus also did some other horrible things as well. If he found circumcised children, he would murder them and force their mothers to wear them around their necks. I mean, he did some horrible things. He destroyed Torahs. He forbade Sabbath observance. He forced the Jews to eat unclean animals. He entered the temple on December 16th, 167 BC, and he offered swine's flesh on the altar. And after that, he also then declared that he and the Greek god Zeus, were the gods that should be worshipped in the temple. Go back to chapter 8, verses 10 through 13. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him. Antiochus also forbid any sacrifices to Yahweh, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of the transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horrors, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. Now, this is really important. The 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, there isn't agreement on this, and I'll get into what some of the other interpretations are. But here's the thing. I told you guys at the outset, when I interpret the scriptures, especially eschatology and especially prophecy, I do it literally unless it tells me not to. Because if we do it any other way, there's too much room to start making up stuff, right? We can make it say whatever we want it to say. And a lot of people do that. So, if you look at verse 14, it says, he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. In the Hebrew, it literally reads this way. And I'm going to actually read it with a couple of Hebrew words here, but I'll explain why in a second. Unto Boker Hareb, 2,300, then shall be cleansed the sanctuary. Okay? Now, some of you in your translations or in your version may have days, but yom is not used there, so it's an improper use of it, and I don't know why a translator would do that. Yom is the Hebrew word for day. So what does Boker Hareb mean in Hebrew? Boker means morning, daybreak, or dawn, and Hareb means dusk, evening, or night. Tracking with me so far? Boker, it's spelled B-O-Q-E-R if you wrote it in English. Morning, daybreak, dawn. Hareb is E-R-E-B, dusk, evening, night. At that time, at the time of Daniel, and when the Jews were allowed to return, when Darius allowed them to go back into Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and restart the sacrificial process all over, right, in the late 6th century BC, at that time, the Jews were used to offering sacrifices at dawn and at dusk. Okay? This is really important to understand. When Antiochus Epiphanes outlawed that practice on December 16th, 167 BC, it would stand until December 14th, 164 BC, when the Maccabees retook Jerusalem and rededicated the temple. This is what the Jews celebrate today, and this is what's known as Hanukkah. Okay? If you divide 2,300 by 2, because it says 2,300 evenings and mornings, okay, you get 1,150. I had to use a calculator to do that. If there are 2,300 mornings and evenings, that would logically indicate the length of time is 1,150 days. 1,150 days equals 3 years and 70 days in a Jewish calendar. A Jewish calendar only has 360 days, okay? And this is going to be, that'll be important next week when we talk about the triumphal entry. This is, give or take a few days, the exact time period between the abomination of desolation on December 16th, 167, and when the Jews were finally able to resume the twice daily offerings of sacrifices in the temple. Now, the sacrifices did not resume on December 14th, 164 BC, when the Maccabees retook Jerusalem and rededicated the temple, because the temple had been defiled and they needed to cleanse it first. Judas Maccabeus only rededicated the temple at that time, okay? He rededicated the temple to God at that time, and then he began to clean house. Now, there is no date recorded in Jewish history for the first sacrifices being offered after this time period, but the 3 years and 70 days is a logical time frame given the actual history and Daniel's prophecy. In other words, it's really, really close. If we don't have a written account of when the first sacrifice took place after they cleansed the temple, well, if it took a week or 2 or 3, then it's right there. In other words, Daniel's prophecy nailed another one. Now, what are some of the other interpretations? The denomination known as the Seventh-day Adventists has said that this is 2,300 years. The problem with that is that would have came up in 1884, and that was also a year that the Seventh-day Adventists said that Christ was coming back, and that was kind of an unfortunate thing. Can you guys, this is a total side and it has nothing to do with anything, but you know what the Seventh-day Adventists are most noted for historically? The invention of breakfast cereal. Seriously, one of the members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was a guy by the name of Kellogg, and because the Seventh-day Adventists followed the Levitical dietary laws, they couldn't eat pork, and what's breakfast without pork? Right? So he invented cereal. Anyway, that has nothing to do with it. Okay? Some people have said that it represents 2,300 days, which is 6 years. And they started it at 170 BC after Antiochus Epiphanes IV conquered Ptolemy and named himself king. But that had nothing to do with the restarting of the sacrifices. So 2,300 mornings and evenings we're looking at from the time sacrifices were outlawed to the time that they restarted after the Maccabean revolt. That being said, Antiochus IV died in 163 BC. He literally died of insanity, which is hilarious because the Jews called him a madman. With his death and the successes of Judas Maccabeus, the Jews were able to regain their independence for a brief period of time. So Daniel sees this vision in chapter 8, verses 3 through 14, and the man who was standing before him is told to answer. This man, his name is Gabriel, and Gabriel's name means man of God, or God is great in Hebrew. He is only mentioned by name in chapter 8 and chapter 9 of the books of Daniel in the Old Testament. It's the only time he's mentioned. So, look at verses 15 through 19. Because this, Gabriel, there's some really, really cool stuff here. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to me where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Well, wait a minute. We just talked about history and it's already happened. Keep that in mind. Now, while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. And he said, Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Okay? Now, Gabriel is incredibly important in Jewish culture, but he's also incredibly important for Christians. In Jewish culture and in the Kabbalah legend states that Gabriel is one of 4 angels that are stationed around the throne of God. The other 4 are Michael, Uriel, and Raphael. And you can read about Raphael and Uriel in the book of Enoch, and there's all kinds of stuff that is talked about in some of those apocryphal works. Okay? Sure. Michael, who he is also named. He's named later in Daniel. Uriel, it's spelled Uriel, and Raphael, Raphael. I think they're all also Ninja Turtles or something. Okay. But people with little, Taylor, you could probably tell me if that's true or not. But Gabriel is also mentioned, as I said, in several apocryphal writings as an angel as well. Now, we also see the angel Gabriel in the New Testament. In Luke's account of the birth of John the Baptist, in Luke chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, and in the foretelling of the birth of Jesus, in Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 33. Now, I believe, and search the scriptures to see if these things are so, Acts 17:11. I believe Gabriel's two conversations with Daniel, this one in Daniel 8 and the other one in Daniel 9, and his conversation with Zacharias, who was John the Baptist's father, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, are connected. Because while Gabriel interprets Daniel's visions in a prophetic way, and we can see, as we've just looked at, that history has shown the vision to be historically accurate to a point, because he's also talking about the end, Antiochus IV was merely a type of what was to come. Both of Gabriel's answers to Daniel in chapter 8 and chapter 9 are messianic in nature and point to the first and second comings of the Messiah. So because of this, there is systematic consistency between Gabriel as the interpreter of a messianic vision in chapter 8 and a messianic answer to Daniel's question in chapter 9, and Gabriel is the announcer of the coming of Jesus' forerunner, John the Baptist, and the coming of Jesus himself. That makes sense? He's the logical guy, because he was telling Daniel all the way back in 551 BC and then in 538 BC what was going to happen. And not only that, when it was going to happen with the coming of Christ. Okay? So Gabriel then interprets the dream. We've read most of that stuff. But I want to go back to verses 17 through 19. So he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. And he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Now, while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. He said, Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Now, there are three things to note. As I just said, Antiochus Epiphanes was a type of what was to come. He was a type of the Antichrist. And as I've also said, there have been lots of types of Christ, so there are also lots of types of Antichrist. And Antiochus Epiphanes was one of those types. Just as he committed the abomination of desolation in 167 BC, the true Antichrist is going to do the exact same thing. Okay? And by the way, again, going back to Solomon, there's nothing new under the sun. Human nature has been opposed to God since the fall of humanity, so naturally, human nature is going to be opposed to anything with regards to God's plan, especially the enemy himself. We've seen types of Antichrist. And why? Why is the enemy so, for lack of a better term, hell-bent on destroying the Jewish people? Well, God's divine plan and agenda will be accomplished and has been accomplished through his chosen people, the Abrahamic covenant. And the devil can read. He reads the same Bible we read. And so he knows, and he's not dumb, he knows what's going on. And if you don't think he doesn't know Scripture, just think of the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. He quoted Scripture, ripped it out of context, but he quoted it. So the devil is acutely aware of God's plan of redemption and restoration of his perfect creation through his chosen people. So the best way to thwart that plan is to destroy the people. He thought he did it by destroying the Son of God. He conquered death. So now the plan is to destroy the people. The Holocaust, everything that happened under Stalin and all the communism. It's going to get worse. Okay? It's going to get worse. We think it's bad now. It's going to get worse. Okay? All of these types of Antichrist are pointing to the nastiness and severity and pure evil of the true Antichrist. So while Antiochus Epiphanes represented a slight glimpse of what evil the Jews should expect to face, and by the way, I think that I think that the goat, as a symbol of the Greek Empire and as a symbol of the coming of the Antichrist, is also significant. And here's why. As a sacrificial animal in the Levitical Old Testament system, the goat stands out because it represented the animal called the scapegoat that was sent out into the wilderness carrying the sins of the nation of Israel on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. Well, who became our scapegoat? And who became our Passover lamb on the cross? Jesus did. As the infinite eternal Passover lamb, as the infinite eternal scapegoat, his blood saves us from eternal death. He, as the scapegoat, took our sin upon himself. Paul said it in 2 Corinthians 5:21. He who knew no sin became sin on our behalf. So the symbol of the goat representing an empire from which the Antichrist will come. Remember what we talked about, how Rome is gone, but the influence of Rome and Greece is gone, but their influence is not. We are still influenced heavily by Western culture. So because of that, the Antichrist coming from the goat is fitting given the nature of the goat becoming or representing the fullness or absolute manifestation of our sin. And another thing, Gabriel makes it clear in verses 17 and 19 that the vision pertained to the end of time. It literally reads in verse 17, at the time of the end. The article "the" is present there. The last end of the indignation, for at the appointed time, the end. Okay? So, Gabriel makes it clear to Daniel that what Daniel is seeing is tied to what will transpire at the very end. And because there is nothing new under the sun, and because the enemy's plan hasn't changed in destroying God's chosen people, that's why types of Antichrist like Antiochus Epiphanes are the types of people that we need to be looking for. Right? Does that make sense? So, remember, last week we talked about chapter 7 being an overview chapter, and we talked about it even more a little bit tonight, about it being kind of the border of the puzzle. So what Daniel sees in chapter 8 and what he is told in chapter 9 and what he sees again in chapters 10 through 12 are details within the framework of chapter 7. In other words, Daniel is receiving a lot more information, okay? Or is having more pieces of the puzzle given to him. In addition to this, we know Gabriel's interpretation of the vision pertains to the end because of what he says in verse 25, where he says this, and through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. The prince of princes. Now, while this seems to be a messianic reference, it can be stated that every type of Antichrist, every sin, every transgression is in essence an attempt to stand up and oppose God and the prince of princes, Jesus Christ. And that's true. But given the context of the chapter and the words of Gabriel in verses 17 and 19, when matched up with Daniel's vision, what is saying here pertains to the end. We can safely interpret then that Daniel's vision in chapter 8 has more details being given to him with regards to his vision in chapter 7. So we can see that the Antichrist in the end will place himself in direct opposition to the Messiah before he is eventually broken without human agency, which simply means it's not going to take any kind of warfare to get rid of him. Christ will speak and it will be over. And then Gabriel says something interesting to Daniel. Verse 26. The vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. If you literally look at that in the Hebrew, the word there literally means shut up, okay? But it can also be translated as seal up. Now in John's Revelation in chapter 5, he sees a scroll with 7 seals on it, and no one could open it except for the Lamb. We don't have time to look at it. You can look at chapter 5. So what this leads me, and again, Acts 17:11, search the scriptures, see if these things are so. What this leads me to believe is that Gabriel wasn't telling Daniel not to share the vision. And by the way, Daniel wrote about it, so if that was the instruction, then Daniel failed miserably, right? What Gabriel was telling Daniel was that the identity of the Antichrist and that the events that will lead to the end will be revealed at the end. So for now, they have been shut up and sealed up by God. And even Jesus in Acts chapter 1, verse 7, when his disciples said, "Is this the time that you're instituting the kingdom?" He said, "That's not for me to know. It's for my Father to know." Okay? So, what does all this tell us? Chapter 8 is getting us closer and closer to even more details about what will transpire. And Daniel then says this in verse 27. "Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. And I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it." Now, because we're obviously running out of time, and I really didn't get to what I wanted to get to, I do want to look at the first 3 verses of chapter 9, and then I'm going to give you a homework assignment. Okay? So chapter 9, verses 1 through 3 say this. "In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So I gave my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and supplication with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes." There's some really good information here, and this is how we'll end it. Number 1, and this is applicational, by the way. Daniel goes to the word before he goes to prayer. I think this is really, really important for us. I think too often I go to prayer first. It's not that it's a bad thing, but we need to go to the word first. I had a professor once say, go to the word before you pray, because then you'll know what to pray for. And you'll know how to pray. And that's pretty profound, right? So, Daniel goes to God's word first, and he prays second. Secondly, Daniel was studying one of his contemporaries. Now, Daniel's an old man by this time. This would have been, the first year of Darius would have been 538 BC. And by the way, that Ahasuerus there in verse 1, that is not Esther's husband. That guy was Xerxes, and he came later. Okay? But look what Daniel was doing. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books. He's talking about the prophetic books of Jeremiah. The reason that's plural, and we only have one book of Jeremiah, unless you count Lamentations, which Jeremiah also wrote, okay, which could be the case. But Jehoiakim so didn't want to hear Jeremiah's message that he burned part of the first scroll that Baruch wrote down for Jeremiah. Anyway, and that you can read about that in Jeremiah, actually. You can read about it in Jeremiah chapter 36. But it says something interesting. He said, I observed the number of years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Go to Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 8 through 14. Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 8 through 14 says this. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants, and against all these nations round about, and I will utterly destroy them and make them a horror and a hissing and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstone, the light of the lamp. This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Now, if you look at your historical timeline of Israel, you will see that Jerusalem and Judah were first conquered by Babylon in 605 BC, and that is when Daniel was taken captive. But because the Jews are a rebellious people, Babylon had to conquer them 2 more times. If you look on your timeline, one of those times was in 597 BC. That's when Ezekiel the prophet was taken back to Babylon. And then finally Nebuchadnezzar had had enough with the rebellious Jews, and so in 586 BC, he not only conquered them again, but he completely leveled the city of Jerusalem, including the temple. And God predicted that it would happen. Now, why would it be 70 years? Well, we don't have time to get into it today, but if you look at the Levitical law in Leviticus chapter 25 and 26, you can put a note next to these verses in Jeremiah. God had instructed in his law that every 7th year was supposed to be a Sabbath year for the land. Okay? We don't do that, and Montana farmers don't do that. They farm differently. So they'll farm one strip of land with a certain crop, and then the next year they either won't farm it at all, or they'll harvest a different crop, right? This is why when you're driving through Montana, especially eastern Montana, you'll see stripes of land, right? One land is dirt, one stripe is dirt, the other has harvest on it. Well, the soil in the promised land in this area is so rich that they could harvest it every year. But after 6 years, all the nutrients start being taken out of it. So just like humans were supposed to have a Sabbath, and we were taken from the ground, or created from the ground, so too then the land had a Sabbath. You tracking with me so far? Well, the Jews weren't following any of God's law. Okay, so evidently, and we don't know what years this happened, but evidently, according to Jeremiah, and he also talks about this in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 10 through 14, that the Jews had not given the land a Sabbath. And so God said, okay, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to force a Sabbath rest on the land. And he did that by conquering his people and taking them out. Now, if Daniel was carried away in 605 BC, and chapter 9, verse 1 says it's the first year of Darius, where Daniel is reading the scriptures, and he comes across the number 70 years for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem, 538 BC, that means that that's 68 years. So Daniel realizes, because he's diligently studying God's word, that the 70 years is almost over. So he wants to know what's going to happen next. Okay? That leads us to his prayer in verses 4 through 19. And that's your homework assignment this week. Read Daniel's prayer. It's super powerful because Daniel takes all this on himself, which he wasn't disobedient. In fact, he was the most obedient guy that we've read about so far, right? But at the same time, he recognized who he was as a sinner. Now, keep in mind, what Daniel is going to the Lord and asking him about is, okay, the 70 years is almost over. What's going to happen after 70 years? Because that's where God is not only going to tell him, but he's going to shock him with some pretty incredible news at the end of chapter 9. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for your word. Thank you that, Lord, thank you that if you make a promise, you're going to keep it. That should encourage our faith and make us feel like we know that you're going to accomplish your will. Lord, I pray that we are a part of your divine plan and that we take the steps to make sure that we are reaching out to all people everywhere to make sure that you are preached. We love you, Lord. In your name I pray. Amen.